ruthless cop swings his baton at the Rock, unaware he just made the biggest mistake of his life. Justice is coming. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. The neon lights of Midtown flickered across the wet pavement, casting eerie shadows as a damp breeze carried the scent of hot dogs and exhaust fumes through the air. A restless city night buzzed with life, taxi horns blaring, street performers drumming on overturned buckets, and vendors shouting their latest deals. Yet amidst the organized chaos, a man sat alone on a metal bench beneath the towering glow of a street lamp. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson adjusted his hoodie, pulling it forward just enough to shield himself from the curious gazes of passers-by. It wasn't often he could sit in public without a crowd swarming him, and tonight he just wanted to be another nameless figure soaking in the energy of the city that never slept. But solitude was fleeting. Patrol Sergeant Vincent Mercer, a hardened, middle-aged cop with a square jaw and a history of flexing his authority where it wasn't needed, strolled down the sidewalk, his eyes scanning for trouble. He wasn't a protector, he was a predator, and the streets were his hunting ground. He prided himself on keeping order, but his version of order had more to do with intimidation than justice. And then he saw him. A lone figure in a hoodie, hunched on a bench, sitting like he owned the place. Mercer's lips curled into a sneer as he adjusted his duty belt. He didn't recognize the Rock, didn't see the legend sitting there. All he saw was a man who, in his mind, didn't belong. With a purposeful stride, Mercer approached, his boots hitting the concrete with a weight that demanded attention. "Hey," he barked, voice thick with authority. "You can't just sit around like that. Move along." Dwayne didn't immediately react. He let the words linger, absorbing them like slow-rolling thunder before a storm. Then, with an exhale, he looked up, his deep, piercing eyes cutting through the dim glow of the street lamp like polished obsidian. "I'm just sitting," he said, voice calm but firm. "That a problem?" Mercer's fingers curled around the baton at his hip, his knuckles going white. He didn't like being questioned. "Yeah, it's a problem," he spat. "People like you think you can loiter wherever you want, but not on my streets." There it was, the unspoken venom behind the words, the assumption, the profiling. Dwayne's jaw flexed, his patience thinning. "And what exactly do you mean by people like me?" he asked, his voice a quiet challenge. Mercer's sneer deepened. "Don't play dumb with me." He took a step closer, his posture aggressive. "I gave you an order. Get up now." Dwayne's muscles coiled beneath his sweatshirt, a volcano of restrained power beneath an unshaken exterior. He didn't move, didn't flinch. His presence alone was enough to make the air feel heavier. "I'm not breaking any laws," he said evenly, "so I'm not going anywhere." Mercer's frustration bubbled over. His authority was being questioned, and that didn't sit right with a man used to obedience. His hand tightened around his baton, his patience snapping like a frayed wire. "You want to play tough?" Mercer growled. Then, without warning, crack! The baton slammed down, striking Dwayne's shoulder with a force meant to instill fear. The sound echoed off the surrounding buildings, the sharp impact splitting the night like a gunshot. A few pedestrians gasped, some reaching for their phones, sensing that something was about to unfold. Mercer smirked, believing he had made his point. But then, Dwayne moved. Slowly, methodically, he rose to his full height, his frame unfolding like a storm gathering over the horizon. He towered over Mercer now, a shadow of pure, unshakable dominance. His dark eyes burned like embers, locked onto the man who had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The air grew thick with anticipation. The moment stretched, every heartbeat amplifying the tension. Mercer's smirk faltered, his brain finally registering the magnitude of the storm he had just provoked. Dwayne rolled his shoulders, the place where the baton had struck barely registering. His lips parted slightly, and when he finally spoke, His words carried the weight of an impending reckoning. Big mistake. Mercer instinctively tightened his grip on the baton, his bravado flickering like a candle in the wind. But it was too late. The lesson was about to begin. The neon haze of Midtown pulsed like a living beast, the city humming with restless energy as the streets teemed with life. People moved in currents, fast, unpredictable, and endless. But amid the storm of motion, one man sat still. Dwayne, "The Rock" Johnson, remained a fortress of calm, perched on the steel bench beneath a flickering streetlight. The hoodie draped over his powerful frame did little to hide the sheer presence he commanded, yet for once he was anonymous. A ghost in plain sight. That is, until Sergeant Vincent Mercer, the self-proclaimed law of these streets, decided otherwise. Mercer's boots pounded against the pavement as he cut through the waves of pedestrians. His face, hardened by years of unchecked authority, twisted in irritation the moment his eyes landed on the Rock. To Mercer, it wasn't about crime, it was about control. He didn't see a legend, he saw someone to exert power over. The tension coiled between them like a serpent waiting to strike. Mercer stopped a foot away, his shadow casting long and ominous over the Rock's seat. I said, "Move along." The Rock barely moved, his head lifting just enough for his gaze to meet Mercer's. The silence stretched thick, each second amplifying the unspoken challenge between them. "I'm not doing anything wrong," the Rock finally said, voice low and deliberate. Mercer's grip tightened around his baton, his blood surging with the need to break that steady calm. He leaned in closer, his breath hot with venom. "People like you think you can sit anywhere you please. Not on my watch." The Rock's eyebrow lifted, slow and calculated. "People like me?" Mercer's smirk was a cruel slash across his face. "Yeah, you heard me." A beat passed, then another. The air between them vibrated with unspoken violence. "Don't play smart," Mercer snapped, his patience thinning like ice under a scorching sun. "This is my city. I say move, you move." The Rock exhaled, his fingers pressing against his knees as if considering his next move. His muscles, coiled beneath the fabric of his hoodie, shifted subtly. "Not breaking any laws," he repeated, each word carrying a quiet storm beneath the surface. Mercer's lip curled. "So that's how it's gonna be?" His hand flashed to the baton, gripping it like a lifeline to his dwindling authority. "Are you resisting me?" Then, crack. The baton came down in a savage arc, slamming against the Rock's shoulder with the force of a man desperate to assert dominance. The impact rang through the night like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the bystanders who had unknowingly gathered, phones appearing in trembling hands, recording what they could barely believe. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the city. Cars honking, neon buzzing. Then the Rock moved, slowly, deliberately, rising to his full, imposing height, his frame eclipsing the street lamp's light, throwing Mercer into shadow. His movements were smooth, unhurried, as if the baton strike had been nothing more than a tap on the shoulder. Mercer's smirk faltered. His bravado flickered, dimming beneath the weight of the storm now staring him down. The Rock rolled his shoulder, testing the spot where the baton had landed, his gaze never breaking for Mercer's. Then, in a voice colder than steel and heavier than judgment, he said, "Big mistake." The onlookers held their breath. The night itself seemed to pause. Mercer scoffed, forcing his confidence back into place. "Oh, yeah?" His sneer dripped with mockery, but his hands betrayed him. They clenched, trembled. "What are you gonna do about it, tough guy?" The Rock didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because in the next instant, Mercer would learn firsthand that there are some forces in this world that neither a badge nor a baton could ever hope to control. The glow of neon signs reflected off the rain-slicked pavement, casting fragmented hues of blue and red across the alley where the confrontation had reached its boiling point. The city's heartbeat pulsed through the distant sirens, the murmuring crowd, and the tension-laced air. Sergeant Vincent Mercer, his authority crumbling, found himself facing a force of nature he had gravely underestimated. His grip on his baton was still tight, knuckles white, but now it was no longer a weapon of power. It was a lifeline to the shreds of control slipping through his fingers. The Rock took a deliberate step forward, his massive frame an indomitable presence. His voice, low and charged with barely restrained fury, sliced through the tense silence. "You think that badge gives you the right to hurt people for no reason?" His words landed like thunderclaps, reverberating through the alley with an unshakable weight. Mercer, his ego a fragile shell on the verge of shattering, swung wildly again. His rage-fueled attack was slow, uncoordinated, a desperate act of a man who had long relied on fear to control his domain. But fear had no hold here. The Rock's movements were a blur. Before the baton could find its mark, he snatched it mid-air, the force of his grip halting its momentum as easily as catching a falling feather. The collective gasp from the gathered onlookers was nearly deafening, disbelief painting their faces. The baton, once a tool of Mercer's unchecked aggression, now dangled uselessly from the Rock's grasp before he tossed it aside like discarded trash. Mercer staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But his pride wouldn't let him relent. His anger blinded him, filling the void where logic should have been. He lunged, fists swinging wildly, desperate to salvage the dominance he had wielded over others for so long. The Rock didn't move. He let Mercer's own fury be his downfall. With a deft sidestep, he twisted just enough to let Mercer's momentum betray him, sending him crashing to the wet pavement. The sound of his body colliding with the unforgiving ground was a sharp contrast to the distant wails of the city's traffic. A chorus of cheers erupted from the growing crowd, their voices a symphony of long-suppressed vindication. "That's what he gets!" someone shouted. Others recorded the moment, their phones capturing what would soon become an undeniable testament to justice served. The Rock didn't bask in their admiration. His eyes remained locked on Mercer, watching as the disgraced sergeant groaned, humiliated and furious. But before Mercer could even think of scrambling to his feet, the stomping of boots echoed down the alley. Two uniformed officers rushed onto the scene, their expressions shifting from concern to outright disbelief as they took in the sight before them. Sergeant Mercer sprawled in a heap at the feet of none other than Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Recognition dawned slowly, like the first crack of sunlight after a long storm. One officer, a younger man with wide eyes, took a hesitant step forward. "Wait, is that—" The second officer, older and seasoned, silenced him with a firm shake of the head. "I know exactly who he is." His gaze flickered toward Mercer, a mixture of disgust and resignation crossing his face. "And I know exactly what you've done." Mercer, his face a mask of defiance, tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. He was caught, trapped beneath the weight of his own arrogance and the unrelenting truth of his actions. The senior officer turned back to the Rock, his tone one of professional respect. "Mr. Johnson," he said, the name now holding a different weight in the air. "Are you all right?" The Rock exhaled, rolling his shoulders back as he studied the fallen officer. Then, with a voice steady as steel, he answered, "I'm fine, but the question is, what are you going to do about him?" The crowd fell silent. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. And for the first time in a long time, justice didn't feel like an abstract idea. It felt real. It felt imminent. And Sergeant Vincent Mercer knew it too. The alley was no longer just a darkened corner of the city. It had become a courtroom, the neon lights flickering like judgmental eyes upon Sergeant Vincent Mercer, whose confidence was eroding with every second that passed. The once dominant enforcer of the law was now standing on unstable ground, surrounded by onlookers who had witnessed his downfall, his shame immortalized in their recording phones. The younger officer, still frozen in shock, managed to whisper, "Wait, is that Dwayne Johnson?" The disbelief in his voice mirrored the collective realization spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Mercer, his hands clenched into trembling fists, snapped his head toward his colleagues. "Who?" he barked, his confusion a final, desperate grasp at his slipping authority. But his words fell flat, his bluster meaningless in the face of the inevitable. The older officer, his face set in a grim expression, took a deliberate step forward, his tone shifting from respect to cold disappointment. "Mr. Johnson," he addressed the Rock, his voice tinged with regret. "Are you all right? We didn't realize it was you." Mercer's world tilted. He looked back at the Rock, suddenly registering the sheer force of presence in front of him. The stories, the headlines, the legend, it all crashed down on him at once. This guy is someone important. His voice, once dripping with arrogance, now quivered with uncertainty. A ripple of agreement flowed through the crowd, their murmurs of outrage growing louder. Mercer's bravado shattered, the full weight of his actions now pressing down on him like an unrelenting tide. I didn't know," Mercer stammered, scrambling for a lifeline. His voice had lost all traces of the authority he once wielded so carelessly. "I didn't know who he was." The Rock finally spoke, his voice an unshakable force, cutting through Mercer's feeble excuses like a blade through glass. "You didn't care to know," he said, his words laced with quiet fury. "You saw what you wanted to see, someone you could control, someone you could intimidate, and you let that badge become a weapon instead of a responsibility." The silence that followed was deafening. Mercer swallowed hard, his face contorting with the realization that there was no escaping this moment. The walls were closing in, the eyes of the city locking onto him like an unrelenting jury. The senior officer squared his shoulders and stepped forward, his voice firm and resolute. "Sergeant Mercer, as of this moment, you are under investigation for misconduct and excessive force. Hand over your badge and your gun." The weight of those words crushed the last vestiges of Mercer's arrogance. His hands trembled as he reached for his badge, his mind racing for an escape that didn't exist. The crowd, their voices hushed, but their eyes burning with justice, watched as the symbol of his authority was stripped away in an instant. A collective exhale swept through the alley. The Rock, his presence unwavering, turned to the crowd, his voice carrying the steady power of a man who had long understood the meaning of standing tall in the face of injustice. "This isn't just about me," he said, meeting their gazes one by one. "It's about every person who's been treated unfairly because of someone like him, people who don't have a camera recording, people who don't get justice." The crowd erupted in agreement. Mercer, now nothing more than a disgraced figure amid the people he once lorded over, stood frozen, his future unraveling before his very eyes. The Rock exhaled, a quiet storm still flickering behind his gaze. Justice had been served, but this was only the beginning of the reckoning. The weight of the night had shifted. The air was no longer thick with tension, but instead carried a newfound energy, a force fueled by justice, long overdue and now finally served. The alley, once a battlefield of intimidation and power, had become a place of reckoning. Sergeant Vincent Mercer had been stripped of his authority, his badge and gun surrendered to the senior officer, and his head hung low as he was led away. His downfall was complete. The crowd, once subdued by fear, now erupted into an electrifying roar. Cheers and applause cascaded through the streets like rolling thunder, a triumphant sound that reverberated off the brick walls and neon signs. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a declaration that they would not be silent in the face of injustice, that no one, not even those in power, was above accountability. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson turned to face the crowd, his massive frame illuminated by the flashing lights of street lamps and cell phones alike. His expression was not one of victory, but of gratitude. He raised a hand, and the crowd instinctively quieted, hanging on his every word. "Thank you," The Rock said, his deep voice carrying the weight of the moment. His eyes scanned the crowd, each face a reflection of something greater, a shared struggle, a common hope. "But this isn't just about me. This is about every person who's been mistreated, every person who's been judged before they even spoke. This is about standing up for each other because no one deserves to be treated the way I was tonight." The silence was thick, but not with fear. It was heavy with understanding, with a fire of conviction that burned brighter than any city light. One voice broke the quiet, a small one. A young boy, no older than 10, pushed through the throng of spectators, a worn notebook clutched in his hands. His wide eyes shimmered with a mixture of admiration and hope as he hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Johnson, can I get your autograph?" A collective chuckle rippled through the crowd, breaking some of the intensity of the moment. The Rock's expression softened, and without hesitation, he crouched down to the boy's level. His presence, once a towering force of power, was now warm and approachable. "Of course, buddy," The Rock said, taking the notebook and flipping it open. "What's your name?" "Ethan," the boy replied, his voice brimming with excitement. With a practiced hand, The Rock signed his name with a flourish before adding a simple but powerful message: "Stay strong, stay kind, always stand tall." As he handed the notebook back, Ethan's mother stepped forward, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Not just for this, but for what you did tonight. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for all of us." The Rock nodded solemnly. "That's the point," he said, his gaze unwavering. "We have to look out for each other. We have to hold the ones who abuse their power accountable, because if we don't, who will?" The words settled over the crowd, cementing themselves into something unshakable. The city would not forget this night. The world would not forget. Justice had found its voice, and there was no silencing it now. With one last glance at the gathered crowd, The Rock straightened, his presence still commanding, but now filled with something deeper, an unspoken promise. The golden glow of streetlights framed his silhouette as he turned and walked away, his steps steady, his purpose clear. He wasn't just walking away from this fight, he was walking towards the next one, and no matter where it came, he would be ready. The story of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's confrontation with injustice serves as a powerful reminder that silence in the face of wrongdoing allows oppression to thrive. It teaches us to stand against racism, abuse of power, and discrimination, regardless of who we are. True strength lies not in physical power, but in unwavering integrity, courage, and the willingness to protect those who cannot defend themselves. Justice is not automatic. It demands action, unity, and accountability. In today's world, we must remain vigilant, speak up for what is right, and ensure that power is used to protect, not to oppress. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe Undercover Insights channel.